Welcome to this webinar on executive functioning and ADHD. My name is Lizanne Schweren and I'm a researcher at the University Medical Center Groningen in the Netherlands. My work focuses mainly on ADHD and other psychiatric disorders and the influence of lifestyle factors, for instance, diet, physical activity, sleep, stress, etc. Today I will talk to you about executive functioning and ADHD and also about the role of lifestyle factors therein. So today's webinar will first be about executive functioning. I will explain to you what it is and how we do measure those functions. I will talk about how ADHD and executive functioning are related to each other. And then I will talk about my own research about which factors influence executive functioning. So executive functions are cognitive functions. In terms of cognitive functions, we have many, for instance, language, motor skills, decision-making, planning, etc. And you can roughly divide them into more simple functions and more complex functions. And executive functions are the more complex functions that require planning, for instance, decision-making, the inhibition of a prepotent response, so monitoring of your own behavior, etc. So the two examples I have here are response inhibition and decision making, but there are a lot of other complex cognitive functions that you might think of, like working memory or cognitive flexibility or changing from one task to the other. So all of those complex cognitive functions are sometimes referred to as executive functions. Executive functioning is wired in the brain, but it's a very complex system. We can't really say that there is one specific area in the brain that is responsible for executive functioning. What we do know is that there is an executive system that involves the frontal cortex, which is mostly responsible for inhibitory control, so inhibiting certain behaviors. And there's also the anterior cingulate cortex, of which we know that it's important for monitoring your own behavior. But there are many other regions that are also involved in executive functioning. So how do we measure executive functioning? Well, since it's a complex system of behaviors, you also need complex tasks to measure it. And normally, if you would want a proper assessment of executive functioning of one person, you would do a whole range of tasks, including tasks of planning, strategic thinking, decision-making, flexibility, etc. If this is not possible, you can just do a single task or maybe one or two tasks that might be indicative of executive functioning. And I'm going to show you 4 tasks that you might use as an indicator of executive functioning. And each of them measure a slightly different aspect of executive functioning. So the first task I wanted to show you is a Stroop task, which is quite well known. So the goal of the task is for participants to name the color that the word is printed in. So not the word itself, but the color it is printed in. Now above the black line, this task is relatively easy. For instance, I'm going to try to do it now. So it's quite easy to tell the color of the word. It's blue, yellow, red, purple, black. And it's relatively easy because the word that is written is also the same as the color. Now when it's not the same, it's actually quite hard and you need to inhibit your response to read the word in order to name the color accurately. So I'm going to try it. It's yellow, red, blue, green, purple. Now you might have noticed that I was quite a bit slower on the second run compared to the first run. And this difference between the first and the second run is what we would call the delay. And this is indicative of executive functioning because it's much harder. The second task I wanted to show you is the Tower of Hanoi or the Tower of London task, where the participant needs to calculate how many steps are needed to go from the picture on the left to the picture on the right, provided that you can only move one bead at a time or one pearl at a time. This is quite a complex task. In this case, I think the answer is 4 or 5. So you would need to be able to calculate this by yourself and to look ahead. A third task is the figural fluency task or the rough figural fluency task, where we ask participants to generate as many unique designs as possible within 1 minute based on those dots. And as you can see, it's quite useful, as you can see in this example below, it's quite useful to be a little bit strategic in this because then you can generate more designs. For instance, on the first row, you can see that this person strategically generated a whole series of designs. And if you don't have any strategy in your drawing, then you're likely to repeat some drawings, etc., and then you'll have fewer unique designs. And finally, the one I wanted to show you is a working memory task, where the researcher reads out a series or a sequence of digits to the participant, and the participants need to repeat the series but in the reverse order. When you can see them on the screen, it's quite easy, but when you can't, you need to just memorize them, then it's really quite hard. So each of these tasks can give you an indication of executive functioning. So what does executive functioning have to do with ADHD? Well, executive functioning and ADHD are not one and the same thing, for sure, but they do have something in common. These executive functioning tasks that I just show you, they do require the participant to pay attention, for one, and sometimes even for a long time, and this is something that people with ADHD tend to struggle with. Also, they sometimes require you to first think and then act, or make a planning, or to adopt some kind of strategy, and to act against your first impulses. And this is also quite difficult for some people with ADHD. And also they require you to not get distracted, which is also quite difficult. So as a result, what we often see is that children and adults with ADHD on these tasks that I just show you perform a little bit worse than children without ADHD or adults without ADHD. So they need a bit more time to name the correct colors in the color words naming task. They can repeat shorter series of sequences of numbers in reverse order. They will generate fewer unique designs, and they will need more time to solve the tower puzzle. Now, what's very important to remember is that this does not count for every participant with ADHD or every person with ADHD, because there's large variability between people. At the same time, there are many people without ADHD who also struggle with these kind of tasks, but because they are, after all, complex tasks. So in scientific terms, these tests are neither very sensitive nor very specific for ADHD, but they do correlate with ADHD symptoms in the end. So what influences our ability to express these executive functioning? Why do some people perform really good on these tasks while others really struggle? And this is quite interesting to know also, because if you know what causes people to be good at it, you might actually think of ways to make yourself better at this task. So part of the variance between people, or the variation between people, is explained by genetics. About 30% of the variance in how good we are at these kind of executive tasks is explained by genetic factors. So these we can't change. But this leaves quite a large chunk of variance that we can actually potentially change, and that's 70%. So this was what I was really interested in. What is this 70% of variance that we cannot explain by genetics? How can we explain that? And this is something that we investigated in the Netherlands. So our study was done in the Lifelines cohort, which is a very large group of people from the north of the Netherlands who participate in research. In the north of the Netherlands, about 1 in 10 adults participate in the Lifelines cohort. So it's a really big group. And this adds up to about 80,000 people in our sample. So these are people just like you and me, who some might have ADHD, but most don't. Some might have depression, but most don't. It's just random people, like people from the streets. We asked all of these people to come into the lab and to perform a rough figure of fluency task, which is the task I just showed you before, where they need to draw as many unique designs as possible in the time of 1 minute. So the more designs you draw, the more points you get, basically. So the better is your executive functioning, the more unique designs. You shouldn't repeat yourself. And in addition to that, we also questioned them about basically everything in their lives. So obviously we asked them about their gender and age, like the basic things, but we also asked them about where they live, what kind of neighborhood it is, how are their friendships, do they smoke, are they in good health, are they much stressed, etc., etc. So lots of different variables, we call them, to see what was going on in their lives, basically. And we hoped to be able to relate some of those variables of what was going on in their lives to their ability for executive functioning. So I'm going to jump right to the results. As you can see here in an R script on the right side of the screen, you can see the model that I fit. And as you can see, the average person scores about 80 points in this task. So just to get you accustomed to the scale that we're talking about. And underneath, what you can see on the right side of the screen is the intercept here, which is about 80. So the average person scores about 80. And underneath is a whole long list of variables that we included in our model to predict executive functioning. Now, what's important in these kind of models is that we do not expect a single factor to explain everything or to explain executive functioning, basically. What we expect is that many different factors will contribute a little bit. And that is also what we saw here. So on an average of 80 points, we saw that 2 factors were most influential in changing the score, with a relatively strong effect. And the first was white ethnicity, or actually non-white ethnicity. So participants with a non-white ethnicity in our sample scored about 8 points lower compared to participants of white ethnicity. We also saw that educational attainment was very influential. So the highest level of education that people had attained in their lives. Those who had achieved low education scored about 6 points lower compared to those who had achieved middle education. And those who had achieved higher education actually scored another 5.5 points higher. So on an average of 80, this is actually quite a strong effect. 5 points on an average of 80 points. Other factors were influential, but not as influential as these two. For instance, we saw that females score about 2.5 points higher compared to males. We also saw that with age, executive functioning declines as expected by about 0.5 point per year. So in 10 years, you might lose about 4 points. Income and other socioeconomic factors were important. Like we saw already for educational attainment, income is also important. So higher income is related to better executive functioning. And the same was true for job status. And we saw that people with diabetes perform worse compared to people without diabetes, with a difference of about -2.5 points. So these are all averages. It doesn't mean that every person with diabetes performs 2.5 points below every person without diabetes. Of course, these are averages across groups. What we also saw, and what was quite interesting and not in line with our expectations, was that heavy drinking was associated with better executive functioning. Now, we had expected if drinking would do anything, really, or alcohol use would do anything, it would probably result in compromised executive functioning or worse executive functioning rather than better executive functioning. So this was quite unexpected, and we decided to dive deeper into that. So one important problem with heavy drinking is that the group allocation is non-random. Ideally, you would want to compare person A who drinks heavily to person B who is exactly the same as person A, except that this person does not drink heavily. But in reality, this is of course not the case, because abstainers, people who do not drink, are on average very different from people who drink heavily. For instance, people who do not drink alcohol are slightly more often depressed compared to people who do drink alcohol. Also, people who do drink alcohol score higher on personality questionnaires like extraversion or impulsivity or excitement seeking compared to people who never drink alcohol. So ideally, you would want to balance these groups in terms of all those covariates, because in reality, they're just not the same. So that's what we did, actually. There's a statistical solution for this problem because it's a well-known problem. And the statistical solution is called multinomial propensity score weighing. So we basically weight our groups or analysis on all of the aspects in which the groups differed from each other, regarding the drinking groups different from each other. And when we do that, we can then run our analysis again and see what comes out. So that's what we did. We ran our analysis again, and now we compared abstainers or abstinent participants to 4 other drinking levels, namely occasional drinkers, light drinkers, moderate drinkers, and heavy drinkers. And now we see that it's not actually the heavy drinkers that have better executive functioning, but it's rather the light and moderate drinkers that have better executive functioning. So it's still not entirely in line with our expectation, but it does make more sense because we know that, for instance, cardiovascular disease risk, the risks of cardiovascular disease are also slightly lower in people who drink light or moderately. So this does actually, did actually make more sense to us as researchers. So I'm going to skip to the take-home message. First, executive functions are complex, higher order functions that involve some kind of planning, strategy making, decision making, some kind of higher order components. 2, many children and adults with ADHD do have difficulty with executive functioning tasks. Of note, many children without ADHD also have difficulty with these tasks, so just keep that in mind, it's an average. And why do some people struggle with executive functions while others do just fine? What influences executive functioning, we found, is that most people who score higher are younger, are of white ethnicity, have higher socioeconomic status, and drink alcohol in moderation. So for those who are interested to learn more about executive functioning and ADHD, or about my last paper that I just discussed, you may find these references interesting to read about this topic. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed it.